A German woman sits on a horse in the middle of Texas. No chains, no guard close enough to stop her. The land stretches flat and golden in every direction, and to the south, somewhere beyond the shimmer of heat and mesquite, the Rio Grande crawls toward Mexico. Freedom. She could dig her heels into the horse and ride. She could cross the river before anyone even noticed she was gone. But she does not move. She closes her eyes. She breathes in the smell of dry grass and warm leather and something else, something she will spend the rest of her life trying to name. Then she whispers a word, not a prayer, a name. The name of the American who once looked at her starving body and said 5 words that broke every rule of war. You are too thin to work. To understand why a prisoner chose to stay when she could run, we need to go back 11 months to a burning airfield in Tunisia, where 12 German women learned that surrender might be worse than death, May 1943. The North African front collapsed like a house built on sand. In Tunisia, more than 230,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in a single month, one of the largest mass surrenders in the history of modern warfare. The Afrika Korps, once the pride of the German war machine, ceased to exist. British and American units rolled forward across terrain still warm with cordite and diesel, and in the chaos of surrender, they found people the propaganda posters never mentioned. 12 German women, not soldiers, not spies, nurses, clerks, radio operators, members of the Wehrmacht Helferinnen, the Women's Auxiliary Corps, that kept the military's paperwork and communications running while men fought and bled in the desert. None of them had fired a rifle in anger. All of them wore the uniform of a regime that had promised victory and delivered ruin. Ingrid Brandt was 27 years old, a Nachrichtenhelferin, a communications assistant from a small horse farm in rural Bavaria. She had grown up on horseback, learned to ride before she learned to read, spent her girlhood teaching children to sit a saddle at her father's stable. The war pulled her away from all of that and put her underground in a concrete bunker that smelled of sweat in hot metal, operating a radio transmitter for generals she never saw. The moment of capture came without drama. The shooting stopped. A German officer appeared in the doorway of the bunker and said 2 words, "Es ist vorbei," it is over. Ingrid and 11 other women stepped into blinding North African sunlight, raised their hands, and waited for the worst. Nazi propaganda had been thorough. For years, radio broadcasts and pamphlets had told them exactly what Americans would do to captured women. Beatings, starvation, worse. One camp rumor repeated so often it felt like fact claimed that American soldiers treated prisoners like animals, working them to death in fields and factories. The women believed it because they had no reason not to. They had never met an American. They had only met the idea of one, and that idea was a monster. But the first American they met was a boy, a private barely 20 with dust on his helmet and a canteen in his hand. He looked at the 12 women standing in the sun with their hands up and their faces tight with fear, and he held out the canteen. Here, he said, that was all, 1 word and a drink of water. It did not match the story they had been told, but it was too small a moment to change anything yet. Fear is not erased by a single act of kindness. It takes many. And these women had a long way to go before they would believe that the world they had entered was not the one they had been promised. They were separated from the male prisoners, counted, listed, and loaded onto trucks, like cargo in a vast machine. From the port, they were marched up a gangway into the dim belly of a converted transport ship. The air below deck was thick with oil and sweat. Hammocks swung in tight rows. Steel walls wept with condensation, and at night the engines roared so loud that any prayer if whispered vanished into the vibration. Food was simple and strange. White bread instead of dark rye. Thin soup. Coffee that tasted burnt and bitter. It was more than many German civilians were getting by 1943, but to women weakened by months of shortage, it barely slowed the weight loss. Among them was Margit Vogt, 24, a clerk and signals operator from Stuttgart. Quiet, watchful. She kept a small notebook hidden in the lining of her coat filled with shorthand that only a trained radio operator could read. She spoke to no one about what was in that notebook, and no one asked. She carried it the way a soldier carries a wound that has not yet been treated. There was Hilda Kraus, 30, a military nurse from Hamburg. She had served in field hospitals at El Alamein and Tunisia, held men together with gauze and willpower, while shells shook the walls, closed the eyes of boys who died calling for their mothers. She carried the weight of every death she had witnessed, and the weight was becoming too heavy to bear. For Hilda, capture was not relief. It was the final humiliation. Nazi doctrine taught that surrender was worse than death, that a German woman must choose honor over survival. Hilda believed it. She had not yet found a reason to stop believing. And there was Elsa Richter, 22, the youngest an artist in her heart, who drew on every scrap of paper she could find, sketching faces and landscapes with a stub of pencil, as if recording the world before it disappeared entirely. The convoy crossed more than 3,000 miles of Atlantic water. Sometimes the women were allowed on deck in guarded groups. Salt wind slapped their faces. They saw other ships on the horizon, gray shapes in long lines, a moving factory of war. When land finally rose ahead of them, it did not look like the bombed and smoking coasts they knew from Europe. Cranes reached into the sky. Warehouses lined busy docks. Behind them, faint in the distance, tall buildings stood against the sky that had never known an air raid. From the port, armed guards moved them into rail cars. The train clattered inland steel wheels, beating a steady rhythm. Through dirty windows, they saw an America that seemed impossible. Fields rolled by green and gold. Small towns flashed past with filling stations and shop windows crowded with goods. At one stop, Ingrid pressed her face to the glass and saw more meat hanging in a single butcher shop than most German families had seen in a month. The country that held them prisoner had more of everything than the country they had fought for. It was the first crack in the wall of propaganda, and it would not be the last. If stories like this matter to you, the kind that reveal a side of World War II most people never hear about, take a moment right now to subscribe and hit the like button. Because what happens next on a dusty Texas ranch is something you truly will not want to miss. Now, while 12 German women rattled across America in a train car 1,000 miles to the southwest, a man named Roy Callahan was staring at empty fields and wondering how he would keep his land alive. Roy was 52 years old, third generation, on 4,000 acres of Texas ranch land north of the small town of Hearn. His grandfather had come from Ireland during the Great Famine, bought the land with sweat and borrowed money, and passed it down through sons who worked it until the soil knew their names. Roy had 2 boys of his own. James, 25, was fighting in Italy. Billy, 22, was dead. Billy was not Roy's son by blood. He was the son of Hank Dawson, Roy's closest friend since childhood, a man who died of pneumonia in the winter of 1935 and left behind a boy with no one else to raise him. Roy took Billy in without a second thought, taught him to ride to mend fence, to read the weather by the color of the sky at dawn. Billy grew up a cowboy in everything but name, and when the war came, he put on a uniform like every other young man in Hearn and shipped out to North Africa with the kind of quiet courage that does not make headlines but wins wars. Billy died at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, the first major defeat of American forces in the European theater. German artillery, coordinated by precise radio signals, found the positions of Billy's company in the narrow valley and tore them apart. More than 6,000 American soldiers were killed or wounded in those terrible days. Billy was 22 years old. The telegram arrived in March. Roy stood outside the horse barn holding the thin paper and did not cry. He just stood there until the sun went down and the sky turned black. Helen found him in the dark, his fingers still clenched around the telegram, so tight the paper had torn. From that day, Roy carried a silent anger. He did not speak about Billy. He did not speak about the war. He worked from first light to last as if the land could absorb the rage that had nowhere else to go. But the anger was there, banked like coals under ash, waiting for wind. Helen Callahan was 48, the true spine of the ranch. She cooked, kept the books, doctored animals when no vet could be found. Her mother had been a German immigrant who arrived in Texas with a single trunk and a recipe book, and who never lost her accent or her love for the dark bread and heavy stews of the old country. That detail, the German mother, would matter more than anyone knew. Frank Lehman, whom everyone called Buck, was the ranch foreman. 45, built like a fence post with a family that came from Bavaria 2 generations back. He still spoke German, still cooked German food on Sundays, but considered himself American to the bone. Buck would become the bridge between 2 worlds that were about to collide. By the summer of 1943, Texas was rich in land and desperately short of people. More than 1 million Texans were in uniform. On many farms, nearly every man between 18 and 35 had gone to war or to the factories and oil fields where the pay was better and the work was safer. Cotton went unpicked. Fences sagged. Cattle wandered through broken wire. One state report warned that without additional labor, as much as 20% of some crops could be lost. Roy felt that crisis every time he rode his fences. The grass keeps growing, whether the boys go to war or not, he told a neighbor one evening. He had more chores than daylight and fewer hands than hope. When he heard in town that Camp Hearn, the prisoner of war camp 15 miles south, was offering German prisoners for agricultural labor, he listened hard. Farmers could apply through the county office. They would receive workers for set hours each day with armed guards. The government ran a formal program, part of the larger system, that by 1944 would hold roughly 425,000 German prisoners across the United States. One afternoon, Roy stopped by the county agent's office. The room was dim and warm, the shelves heavy with ledgers. On a bulletin board among posters about war bonds and ration stamps, he saw a new type sheet. 12 German women available for agricultural labor under strict supervision. Women, he read it twice. He had heard of Italian and German men picking cotton and chopping timber, but women behind barbed wire was something else entirely. That evening, over a plain supper of thin meat and homegrown vegetables and coffee, stretched with chicory, he told Helen. Women, she said slowly. Doing ranch work, I need hands, he answered. Right now, I do not have the luxury of being choosy. He did not tell her what he was truly thinking, that these women came from the same theater of war that had killed Billy, that every time he looked at a German uniform, he saw the enemy that took his boy. But what Roy Callahan could not know, sitting at that kitchen table with the clock ticking and the crickets singing outside, was that among those 12 women was one whose hands had helped kill Billy. Not with a rifle, not with a grenade, with a radio frequency. And the day would come when he would have to decide what to do about it. 3 days later, Roy and Buck drove to Camp Hearn. The road ran past fields of corn and sorghum, some neat, some choked with weeds where no one had time to tend them. At the camp gate, a guard checked their papers. The heat pressed down like a hand on the back of the neck, and from the distant mess hall came the hiss and pop of onions and canned meat in big iron pans. Captain Edward Mills, the camp commander, met them inside the wire. His shirt was crisply pressed despite the heat. Mills was a practical man who followed regulations the way a carpenter follows a level, not out of passion, but out of the belief that straight lines prevent collapse. He walked them past barracks and watchtowers, explaining the rules in a flat, careful voice. Work hours limited by daylight. Guards always present. No private contact. No favors. They are enemy personnel, he said, not guests. Then Roy saw them. 12 women standing in a loose line beside the mess hall, shaded by a narrow strip of tin roof. Their gray uniforms hung off their frames like clothes borrowed from larger people. Cheekbones pushed against thin skin. One arm was in a sling. Another woman's hands trembled, even though the air was hot and still. They looked less like the bold enemy women on propaganda posters, strong-armed and cold-eyed, and more like patients from a hospital that had run out of medicine. Buck spoke to them softly in German. They answered with short words and tired voices. They say they are fit for work, Buck translated. Roy studied them. He thought of barbed wire, of army rules, of his empty pastures, of how easily a thin woman could collapse in the Texas noon sun. He stood before the line hat in his hand. He looked from face to face, from loose uniform to sharp bone, and when he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. Tell them, they are too thin to work. Buck translated into German. The words hung in the hot air like something fragile. For a moment, the women thought it was a cruel joke. Work was the one thing they were certain the Americans would demand. Ingrid later wrote, "We waited for laughter or shouting. Instead, there was only silence in his troubled face." Captain Mills frowned. Regulations say all able prisoners must perform productive labor. Roy nodded slowly. Maybe so, Captain. But you send these ladies into a Texas field for 8 or 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, and they will drop before the first fence line. That is not productive either. The paradox hung between them. The Army needed them to work. Roy needed help. But the very hunger that made them seem strong enough to ship across an ocean now made them useless for the heavy labor the rules assumed. Roy made his offer. Let me take all 12. I will sign for them. I will use them on the ranch, but not in the fields. Not at first. Let me put some weight on them, build them up. Then they will be more use to you and to me. Mills hesitated. There was no line on his forms for heal them first. But he also knew that sick prisoners meant incident reports, medical inspections, and trouble from above. You understand, the captain said at last. I cannot authorize special treatment. Agricultural labor only. Guarded, logged. I understand, Captain Roy answered. Just put us down for 12 workers. That evening, Roy drove home under a red sky. His truck rattled over ruts and loose stone dust boiling up behind the tires. Helen met him at the door, wiping her hands on a flour towel. The kitchen was warm, the windows fogged from the pot of beans simmering on the stove. He told her what he had seen. The sling, the shaking hands, the hollow faces. They are supposed to fix my labor problem, he said, but they look more like they belong in your pantry than my pastures. Helen sat down at the wooden table. Buck joined them, his big hands wrapped around a coffee cup. The small house grew quiet except for the ticking clock and the faint sound of crickets outside. Helen suggested letting the women help around the house. Cleaning, canning, sewing. Roy shook his head. I saw their eyes. They are used to doing important work even if it was for the wrong side. Nurses, clerks, radio people. If I lock them in a kitchen, they will feel like they have been put in a box. That will not build them up. It will break them a different way. Buck cleared his throat. Back in Bavaria, my aunt said girls learned to ride before they could read properly. Maybe some of them know horses. The room went quiet. Helen looked up. Why not, she said. You have gentle horses, safe corrals. They could learn to ride, check fences, move the smaller groups of cattle. It is real work, but it gives them something strong under them instead of just fear. Roy stared at her. Teach enemy prisoners to ride my horses. He imagined the colonel's face. It did not look pleased. Will the army approve, Buck asked. Probably not, Roy said. But the regulations say agricultural labor. They do not say the person holding the reins has to be a man. Helen placed her hand flat on the table. You always told our boys. Always told our... Do the right thing first. Answer questions later. Roy rubbed his temples. It was a quiet rebellion planned over coffee at a plain kitchen table. They would take the 12 women. They would do the paperwork. So many hours, so many tasks, so many acres. But the road to that work would run through the back of a horse. While that plan took shape in a warm Texas kitchen, something else was happening behind the wire at Camp Hearn. In the women's barracks, Margaret Vaux sat alone on her bunk. She opened the small notebook she kept hidden in her coat lining and wrote in the shorthand that only a trained signals operator could read. The contents, if decoded, would reveal that Margaret had served as a senior Nachrichtenhelferin at the Afrika Korps radio station, relaying tactical signals for General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim during the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943. Her fingers on the transmitter keys had helped German artillery coordinate the attack through the pass. She did not pull a trigger. She did not aim a gun, but the signals she sent helped the shells find their targets. Among the more than 6,000 American casualties was a 22-year-old soldier named Billy Dawson, the boy Roy Callahan had raised as his own son. Margaret did not know Roy. Roy did not know Margaret, but war had tied them together with a thread of blood that neither of them could yet see, and that thread would pull tight before the year was over. 3 mornings later, just after dawn, a military truck rattled to a stop inside the gate of Callahan Ranch. The sun was still low, painting the eastern sky in bands of gold and pink. Cool air carried the scent of dew on grass mixed with dust and something sharper that the women did not recognize at first. Hay and horse sweat. They climbed down chains clinking softly against the tailgate. Instead of rows of crops, they saw a wide dirt corral fenced with rough wooden boards. Inside stood 8 saddled horses, calm in the morning light, coats shining brown and black and cream. One flicked its ears, another snorted, breath puffing white in the cool air. No one moved. We thought it was some kind of test, Margaret later wrote. We looked for the shovels, the heavy tools. Instead, there were animals waiting for riders we did not believe we could be. Roy stood by the fence with Helen and 2 older ranch hands. Buck translated as Roy spoke. Today, you will not go to the fields. First, you will learn to be around the horses. Then, if you wish, maybe you will learn to ride. The offer was a paradox all by itself. They were prisoners, yet they were being asked what they wanted. Ingrid stepped forward. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were clear. I taught riding in Bavaria, she told Buck quietly. Before the war. Buck nodded to Roy. She knows horses. Roy led her toward a sorrel mare named Honey. Up close, the animal radiated warmth and life, a mixture of leather dust and sweet hay. Ingrid reached out. For a few seconds, her fingers hovered over the mare's neck. Then she laid her palm flat on the smooth coat. She began to cry. Not loud, just silent tears cutting lines through the dust on her face. In that moment, she wrote later, I remembered who I had been before I was only a number. The first day passed in slow, careful work. Learning to brush horses in long strokes. Learning to speak softly and move calmly around animals that weighed 10 times what they did. Helen came out every morning with cold lemonade in a big glass jar and showed them how to braid the horses' manes, how to sit a little taller, how to laugh at small mistakes. It felt like peace. It felt like something none of them had earned and all of them needed. But that first night after the women returned to Camp Hearn, peace shattered. Hilda Kraus could not sleep. The barracks were dark and close, the sound of breathing all around her, and in her mind the images would not stop. The field hospital at El Alamein, the boy whose legs she could not save, the smell of gauze soaked through. She had believed, truly believed, that the suffering meant something, that the cause justified every horror she had witnessed. But today on the ranch, an American woman had handed her a glass of lemonade and smiled as if Hilda were a neighbor, not an enemy. If Americans were not monsters, then everything she had endured and everything she had done in the name of the Reich was meaningless. The war was meaningless. Her sacrifice was meaningless. And she was meaningless. At 2 in the morning, Hilda rose from her bunk and walked to the utility shed at the far end of the women's compound. She found a length of rope. She tied it to a crossbeam. She stood on a wooden crate and looked at the knot she had made with the same steady hands that had tied 1,000 surgical knots in field hospitals across North Africa. The night guard, a corporal named Davis, made his rounds at 2:30. He saw the shed door ajar, light leaking through the crack. When he pushed it open and found Hilda on the crate, he did the only thing he could think of. He radioed the duty officer who telephoned Captain Mills, who telephoned the one civilian who had signed responsibility for these 12 women, Roy Callahan. Roy was at Camp Hearn within 20 minutes, still pulling on his jacket, his boots unlaced. He walked into the shed where Hildy stood on the crate, the rope still taped to arm above her, 2 guards flanking the door with the helpless look of men trained for perimeters. Not for this. Mills had ordered them not to touch her. She was standing still, not fighting, not moving, just waiting, her eyes fixed on something none of them could see. Roy told the guards to step outside. Mills started to object. Roy said, "Please, Captain, just give me the room." Mills hesitated, then nodded. Roy stepped closer. He moved the way he would approach a panicked horse, hands open, palms up, no weapon, no threat. He spoke very softly, knowing she could not understand the words, but hoping she could understand the voice. "Easy now, easy. You do not have to do this. Not tonight, not ever." Hilda looked at him. The rope creaked above her. Tears fell. She stepped down from the crate. Roy cut the rope, coiled it, and put it in his coat pocket. He led her outside, and they sat together on the steps of the nearest barracks. The Texas sky was full of stars, more stars than either of them could count, and neither of them said a word. Captor and captive sitting in the darkness until the first light of dawn crept over the eastern horizon, and the camp began to stir. That morning, Roy told Captain Mills that Hilda needed purpose, not a military psychiatric ward, but real work and real human connection. He proposed making her the group's basic medical attendant, caring for the women and for livestock on the ranch. Mills agreed. He did not want a suicide in his monthly report. 2 weeks passed. The women began sitting in saddles. Roy used a lunge line, a long rope that kept horse and rider moving in a safe circle. Horses walked. Women searched for balance. Some clung tight with wide eyes. Others relaxed faster. Ingrid moved with the easy grace of someone returning to an old language she had never truly forgotten. Margaret asked to try riding free. Roy saddled old Pete, a patient gelding who had taught 3 generations of Callahans and ranch hands to ride. Margaret climbed up with help. Her legs shook. Buck repeated Roy's instructions. Hold the reins here. Gentle squeeze to move. Pull back to stop. He wants to listen to you. Pete walked. Dust puffed under his hooves. At first, Margaret sat stiff, hands gripping the reins too tight. Slowly, her shoulders dropped, her back straightened. By the 3rd circle around the corral, she was smiling. When she slid down, her legs nearly gave out. For a little while, she told Helen, "I forgot I was a prisoner." But while Margaret smiled on the back of a horse, a discovery was being made that would test everything Roy Callahan believed about mercy. Buck cleaning tack in the barn found a small notebook on the floor beneath the fence rail where the women hung their coats. It must have worked loose from a pocket or a lining seam. Buck opened it, expecting a diary or a letter home. What he found was rows of shorthand, dense and precise, the kind of notation that only a trained military communications operator would use. He recognized it from his own brief service as a translator during the last war. He brought it to Roy. Roy asked an intelligence officer at Camp Hearn to decode the contents. The report came back in 3 days. Margaret Vogt, Senior Signals Operator, Africa Course Communications Unit, direct relay of tactical coordinates during the Battle of Kasserine Pass, February 1943. Roy read the words, Kasserine Pass, the same valley, the same month, the same shells that killed Billy Dawson. Margaret had not pulled a trigger, but her fingers on the transmitter keys had sent the signals that guided the artillery to Billy's position. She was a link in the machine that destroyed the boy Roy loved like a son. That evening, after the women had gone back to camp and the ranch was quiet, Roy sat on the porch as the sky darkened. Helen was inside. Buck had gone home. Roy was alone with the knowledge that the woman he had put on a horse that afternoon, the woman who had smiled for the first time in months, had helped kill Billy. He went to the barn. He picked up a leather strap from the tack wall. Not reins for riding, something heavier. He held it in both hands and walked toward the road that led to Camp Hearn. He got as far as the gate. The metal latch was cold under his fingers. He stood there gripping the leather while the stars came out and the coyotes began to call from the creek bed, and he thought about Billy. Billy at 15 laughing on the back of a horse as it broke into a gallop for the first time. Billy at 18 helping him fix fence in the rain mud on his face and joy in his eyes. Billy at 22 waving from the train platform in his uniform, not knowing he would never come home. Billy in a sealed coffin that the army would not let them open because there was not enough left to look at. Then he thought of Margaret, the thin woman smiling on the back of old Pete that afternoon. The woman who said, "I forgot I was a prisoner." She sent the signals that killed Billy. Roy's fingers went white on the leather strap. He lifted the gate latch, then he stopped. He remembered Hilda on the crate in the shed. He remembered his own voice saying, "Easy now, you do not have to do this." If he went to Camp Hearn tonight and did what the rage in his chest was begging him to do, he would become exactly what Nazi propaganda said Americans were. He would prove them right. Roy hung the strap back on the tack wall. He walked to the kitchen. He sat at the table and wrote a letter to Hank Dawson, a letter that could never be mailed because Hank was buried in the Hearn Cemetery under a stone that said, "Beloved father and faithful friend." But the letter needed to be written. Hank, I found the hands that helped kill our boy. They are thin hands. They shake when they hold a coffee cup. I almost became what they said we were, but I did not. Not for them, for Billy. Because if Billy saw me do what I almost did tonight, he would not recognize his own father. Helen found Roy at the kitchen table at 5 in the morning. The letter lay before him. His coffee was cold. She read the letter without a word. Then she placed her hand on his shoulder and stood there until the first light came through the window and the birds began to sing outside. That letter will never be mailed, but the words in it will save a life before the year is over. Roy decided not to tell Margaret that he knew. He would let her keep writing, keep healing, keep believing her secret was safe. Because mercy is not the absence of anger. It is the decision to act against it. But secrets do not stay buried forever. And the person who would drag this one into the open was already on his way to Camp Hearn, carrying a thick file of regulations and a heart full of grief that had hardened into something very close to hate. The autumn of 1944 arrived in Texas not with the dramatic turn of leaves that New England knows, but with a slow exhale. The heat backed off a degree at a time. Mornings carried a coolness that made breath visible for just a second before the sun burned it away. The grass changed from burning gold to something softer, and the horses moved with more energy, freed from the burden of those brutal summer afternoons. On the Callahan Ranch, 12 German women had become something no regulation book had a name for. They were not quite workers, not quite guests, not quite prisoners in any way that matched the posters on the camp bulletin board. They were women who rode horses across 4,000 acres of Texas land, checking fence posts, marking breaks in wire, moving small herds of cattle from one pasture to another, monitoring water tanks, and reporting back to Roy and Buck with a precision that surprised even the old ranch hands who had been doing this work for decades. Ingrid Brandt had become the natural leader. She rode 15 miles a day without complaint, her back straight, her hands easy on the reins, her eyes reading the land the way she once read radio frequencies. She led groups of 2 or 3 women along the fence lines, and each evening, Buck collected their reports and translated them into the logbook that Captain Mills required. On paper, it was agricultural labor. In practice, it was something closer to resurrection. Hilda Kraus had found her purpose. The nurse who had stood on a crate with a rope above her head 2 months earlier now spent her mornings checking the horses for injuries, cleaning hooves, treating small infections with supplies Helena provided. When a calf was born breech in the south pasture, Hilda was the one who knelt in the mud and turned it with hands that had turned wounded soldiers on operating tables. The calf lived. Hilda named it Anfang, beginning. She did not explain why, but everyone understood. Margaret Volk remained quieter than the others, riding old Pete along the fence lines with a steady patience that matched the horse's own temperament. She had begun to learn English from Helen, simple phrases at first, then longer sentences, then the names of tools and plants and weather patterns that made up the daily language of ranch life. She did not know that Roy carried a terrible knowledge about her. She only knew that something in his eyes when he looked at her was different from the way he looked at the other women. Something heavier. Something kept behind a door she could not see through. Elsa Richter drew everything. The horses, the fence lines, the way light shifted across the corral at different hours. She used scraps of paper, the backs of feed invoices, the margins of old newspapers. Helen gave her a proper sketchbook one morning, without explanation, and Elsa held it against her chest the way a child holds a gift too precious to open right away. Not all of the women embraced the new life equally. Renate Fischbach, a clerk from Dusseldorf, kept her distance from the Americans and spoke sharply to any woman she caught smiling too easily around the ranch hands. "We are prisoners of war," she reminded them, "not ranch girls playing cowboy. These people bombed our cities." Renate was not cruel, but she was faithful to an idea of Germany that the ranch was slowly dissolving, and she resented the dissolution. She wore her uniform buttoned to the collar even in the heat, as if loosening it would mean loosening something else. The tension between Renate's rigid loyalty and Ingrid's growing trust created a quiet friction in the barracks that surfaced in sharp words and cold silences and made the women choose not in any dramatic way, but in the small daily decisions about who to sit with, who to ride with, and who to believe. The ranch hands had softened toward the women in ways that would have been unthinkable 3 months earlier. Old Joe Myers, who had lost a nephew at Anzio and initially refused to work alongside Germans, now saved the apple from his lunch for Ingrid's horse. Tommy Baker, the young guard who barely needed to shave, had taken to asking Buck how to say simple things in German. "Good morning," "Nice day," "The horse looks good." He practiced the phrases under his breath while he walked the fence line, his rifle slung over one shoulder. Everything was working. Everything was calm. And that was precisely when calm ended. Because the man who arrived on a Tuesday morning in October in a military jeep trailing half a mile of dust had not come to admire horses. Captain Vernon Holt stepped out of the jeep the way a man steps into a room he already knows he disapproves of. He was 48 years old, tall and thin, with a uniform pressed so sharp it looked like it could cut paper. His face was clean-shaven, his jaw set, his gray eyes taking in everything and revealing nothing. He carried a leather briefcase thick with files and a clipboard that he held against his ribs like a shield. Holt was an inspection officer from the War Department's Prisoner of War Division stationed at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio. His job was to visit prisoner labor programs across Texas and ensure compliance with the Geneva Convention, the War Department's own regulations, and the specific terms of each labor agreement. He had visited dozens of camps and farms. He had filed dozens of reports. He had shut down 3 programs for violations and recommended disciplinary action against 2 camp commanders. He was thorough. He was precise. He was by every institutional measure excellent at his job. He was also a man who had buried his only son. Second Lieutenant Daniel Holt, 23, had been an artillery officer at Kasserine Pass. He died in February 1943 when German shells guided by radio coordinates from Afrika Korps communications units destroyed his gun position. The same battle, the same valley, the same coordinated attack that killed Billy Dawson. Daniel Holt and Billy Dawson may have died within minutes of each other, perhaps within yards, their blood mixing in the same North African dust. Vernon Holt did not process his grief the way Roy Callahan did. Roy buried his anger under work and silence. Holt built a fortress of rules around his pain. If the system worked perfectly, if every regulation was followed to the letter, if every prisoner was treated exactly as the manual prescribed, then the chaos that killed his son could be controlled. Order was Holt's answer to loss, and disorder was a personal affront to his son's memory. He stood at the corral fence and watched two German women ride slowly around the ring while others cleaned hooves and checked saddles. His pen moved across the clipboard. His face showed nothing. "This is not agricultural labor," he said to Roy, his voice even and precise the way a surgeon describes a procedure that will cause pain. "This is recreational activity for enemy combatants." "I will note it in my report," Roy explained. "They check fences, they move cattle, they monitor water tanks. Last week they helped bring in strays from the north pasture. Could not have done it on foot." Holt flipped on through the logbook Buck had prepared. "Your records show 40 hours of fence inspection last week for 12 women across 4,000 acres. That averages 3.3 hours per person per day. The regulation minimum for productive labor is 6 hours. You are logging half days as full days." Roy said nothing. Holt was right. Roy had been recording shorter work hours to give the women time to rest and recover strength. It was a kindness. It was also, by the strict letter of military regulation, a falsification of records. Holt continued, "I will conduct a full review over the next 30 days. If I find further irregularities, I will recommend transfer of all 12 prisoners to Camp Livingston, Louisiana for standard labor assignment." Camp Livingston, a larger camp in the swampy lowlands of central Louisiana where prisoners dug drainage ditches and cleared timber in heat and humidity that broke strong men. For 12 women who had only recently stopped trembling from malnutrition, it would be a slow destruction dressed in transfer paperwork. Holt was not a villain. That was what made him dangerous. He did not beat prisoners. He did not shout or threaten. He used the system. He used paperwork. He used the precise language of regulations written by men in offices who had never stood in a Texas corral and watched a starving woman learn to sit a horse. Holt believed that special treatment for enemy prisoners was a betrayal of every American soldier who had died fighting them. From his perspective, he was absolutely right. He was protecting the memory of his son. That belief, reasonable and rooted in genuine pain, was the most formidable weapon he carried, more dangerous than any gun. Because you cannot argue a man out of grief. If you are still with me, take a second right now to hit that like button, because the next part of this story will test everything these women have built, and you will not want to look away. The weeks that followed were tense in ways the women felt, even if they could not name them. Holt returned every week. He measured, he counted, he compared. Each visit, the air on the ranch grew heavier. Ingrid called him Der Buchhalter, the accountant. She said it with a thin smile, but her eyes were worried. Roy adjusted. He increased the actual working hours, reduced rest time. The women now checked fences 6 hours a day instead of 3, riding longer loops, carrying tools, repairing wire as they found it. The work was harder, but they were stronger now, and they did it without complaint. Ingrid led by example, riding until her legs ached and her hands were raw from pliers and wire. But Holt found another angle. He discovered that Helen had been allowing the women to eat lunch at the same table as the family inside the ranch house. The regulation was explicit. Prisoners eat separately under guard supervision in designated areas. Helen's shared meals were a violation. Fraternization between civilian family members and enemy personnel. Holt wrote it in his file, noted the date, the time, the names present. Roy faced a choice: stop the shared meals or face a formal infraction that would strengthen Holt's case for shutting everything down. He chose compliance. From that day, the women ate in the barn on rough wooden benches. Helen brought the same food prepared with the same care, but she could not sit with them. It was a small change. A plate of stew tastes the same on a hay bale as on a kitchen chair. But the women felt the difference. A wall had gone up where a door had been. Even Renati, who had kept her distance from the Americans, looked stung. Being separated by your own choice was one thing. Being separated by someone else's order was another. And the trouble was not finished. Because inside Camp Hearn, loyalty and survival were about to collide in a way that would force Ingrid Brandt to make the hardest choice of her life. She heard about it on a Wednesday. Renati whispered it in the shower block at camp, her voice barely audible over the sound of water hitting concrete. 5 men, German prisoners, led by a corporal named Kurt Wenzel, a hardline soldier who still wore his loyalty to the Nazi regime like a scar he was proud of. They were planning to escape. The route ran south through the back of a supply truck, then overland to the Mexican border, then by whatever means possible to the Gulf of Mexico, where Wenzel believed German submarines still patrolled. He did not know that the submarine war was already lost, that the Atlantic had become an American lake. He only knew that staying in a prison camp while Germany burned was a shame he could not endure. The escape was planned for the following Saturday. If it succeeded or even if it failed, the consequences would be immediate and devastating. Any breach of security would trigger an automatic lockdown. All external labor programs would be suspended pending investigation. The women would lose the ranch, the horses, Roy and Helen. Everything they had built in 6 months of slow, careful trust would be erased by 5 men running through the dark. And Holt would have his perfect reason to file the transfer order. Ingrid did not sleep for 3 nights. She lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the breathing of 11 women around her, and she thought about loyalty. She was German. Wenzel and his men were German. They shared a language, a homeland, a uniform. To betray them was to betray her own blood. But she also thought about Honey, the sorrel mare whose neck she touched every morning. About Helen, who brought lemonade and taught her to braid horsehair. About Roy, who carried a terrible secret about Margaret and chose mercy over revenge. About Hilda, who was alive because a rancher drove to a camp at 2:30 in the morning and spoke to her the way you speak to a frightened animal. Easy now. You do not have to do this. Renati cornered Ingrid on the second night. You know about the plan, Renati said. Her eyes were hard. They are our countrymen. You will say nothing. Ingrid looked at her. I will do what I believe is right, she answered. Renati's face tightened. Then you are no longer German, she said and walked away. On the third night, Ingrid made her decision. She told Buck first. Buck brought her to Roy. In the dim kitchen with the clock ticking and the coffee growing cold, Ingrid told them everything. The names, the plan, the route, the timing. Roy listened with a face that gave nothing away. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said through Buck something she would carry for the rest of her life. Thank you. This took more courage than anything I have done in this war. Roy contacted Captain Mills. Security was quietly increased. The 5 men were discovered digging a tunnel beneath the south fence on Friday night, one day before their planned escape. Wenzel and his group were transferred to a high-security camp in another state. No one at Camp Hearn knew that the information had come from a woman in the barracks next door. But knowing and feeling are different animals. Ingrid had saved 12 women. She had also condemned 5 men. She wrote about it only once years later in a letter to her granddaughter. I saved us, but I condemned them. War does not let you rescue everyone. It only lets you choose who you carry and who you leave behind. I chose the women. I chose the horses. I chose the ranch where an American said we were too thin to work. I do not regret it, but I do not forget it either. A week after the failed escape, a folded note appeared under Ingrid's pillow. Written in German in a hand she did not recognize. We know what you did. Traitors pay. Ingrid sat on her bunk that night with her back against the wall and her eyes on the door, and she did not move until dawn. The man who wrote it, an ally of Wenzel who had remained in camp, was transferred within days. The threat dissolved, but the fear stayed with Ingrid for weeks afterward, sharp as a sound heard in the dark. Renati stopped speaking to Ingrid entirely. She still rode with the group, still did the work, but she moved through the days like a woman walking through a house she no longer recognized. By spring, even she would begin to soften. But that is later. For now, the silence between the 2 women was another kind of fence, strung tight and hard to cross. December came. The days grew short and sharp. Frost dusted the grass some mornings, and the horse's breath made small white clouds in the early air. The women arrived at the ranch with thin coats and shoulders hunched against the wind. Helen watched them from the kitchen window and felt something tighten in her chest. One evening, stacking jars in the pantry, surrounded by the sharp sweetness of preserved peaches, she spoke to Roy. We should do something for Christmas. One evening, a real meal, a tree, songs. Roy studied her. They are prisoners, Helen, the rules. The rules bend every time you put a German girl on a Texas horse, she answered. They are far from home. Some of their homes are gone. One good night will not lose this war. He thought of James eating from a tin plate somewhere in Italy. He thought of Billy, who would never eat another Christmas dinner anywhere. Then he thought of the women riding his fences in the cold without complaint, and of Ingrid, who had betrayed her own countrymen to protect a life that an American rancher had offered them. The negotiations with the army took 3 days. Captain Mills approved it with conditions. Guards present, no alcohol, everyone back behind the wire by nightfall. On paper, it was just an approved holiday meal for a work detachment. Duration 4 hours. Personnel 12 enemy prisoners, 6 civilians, 3 guards. Holt knew about it. Of course he did. He did not object openly. He simply added it to his growing file. One more entry, one more brick in the case he was building. On Christmas Eve, the truck arrived while the sky was still pale. The women climbed down into air that was sharp with cold earth and the faint sweetness of wood smoke from the chimney. When they stepped into the ranch house, warmth hit them like an embrace. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace. Pine branches hung along the mantel bright with paper ornaments cut from old catalogs. The table was set for more than a dozen people. Helen had planned for weeks. Roast chickens with skin crisped to a deep golden brown. Mashed potatoes rich and heavy with butter. Green beans from the summer garden put up in jars months ago for exactly this purpose. Fresh bread that filled the house with warmth of its own yeasty and golden. And pie. Peach pie made from the gold slices of canned fruit she had been saving since August, the crust flaky and dusted with sugar that caught the light from the fireplace. At that time, an average German civilian struggled to reach 1,500 calories a day. Here, even prisoners sat before more food than many families in Europe could now imagine. The aroma alone was an argument. Roast chicken and pine and wood smoke and bread and butter, and the deep amber sweetness of peaches and sugar. For women who remembered hunger the way other people remember childhood, that fragrance was more powerful than any speech about mercy or kindness. It was simply proof. Proof that this country had enough to share even with the people it was fighting. Guards ranch hands, Roy's family, and the 12 German women took places around the same table. It felt strange at first. Uniforms brushed against work shirts. Foreign words bumped against English. Knives and forks clicked on plates in the only language everyone shared. But hunger and warmth did their work, and slowly the stiffness melted. People began to talk in short phrases with Buck and the young guard Tommy Baker translating where they could. Even Renate ate in silence but without protest, and when Helen placed a second slice of pie on her plate, Renate looked up and said very quietly, Dinky. After dinner, Ingrid taught Helen a German Christmas carol. Stille Nacht, silent night. The women sang first, their voices soft but sure, and the room filled with a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the war. The melody was simple. The German words were old. Pine and cooling gravy, and the warmth of the fireplace wrapped around the music like a blanket. Then Tommy Baker began to sing, in German. His voice was young and slightly off-key, but the words were right. He had learned them from his grandmother, a Bavarian woman who crossed the ocean 50 years earlier and never stopped singing the songs of home to her grandchildren. He sang with his eyes half closed and his hands folded in his lap. And when he reached the second verse, 2 of the other women joined in, and then Helen hummed along, and for a moment the kitchen held something that no regulation could account for and no report could capture. Helen covered her mouth with her hand. Later she would say, for a few minutes, I forgot which side anyone was on. Margaret wrote for that one night the war was outside. We were not captors and captives. We were just people who missed home. When the singing stopped, Ingrid reached into the pocket of her coat and brought out something wrapped in a scrap of cloth. She placed it in Roy's hands. Inside was a small horse carved from a piece of scrap wood with a folding knife and endless patience. The curve of the neck, the set of the ears, the slight tilt of the head. It was Honey, the sorrel mare, carved with such care that Roy could almost feel the animal breathe. You gave us back our strength, Ingrid said through Buck. I can only give you this. Prisoners were not supposed to give presents to their captors. But here it was a carved horse sitting in the rough hands of a Texas rancher, and it was the most honest thing either of them had touched in months. Roy closed his fingers around the carving and nodded once. He did not trust himself to speak. Helen squeezed his arm. The fire popped. Outside, the stars were cold and bright over Texas, and somewhere in Europe the war ground on. But in this kitchen, for this one night, the war had no jurisdiction. That night, after the truck carried the women back to camp, Helen asked Roy the question he had been avoiding. "Do you think Captain Holt will use tonight against us?" Roy did not answer for a long time. Then he said he already has. Every meal, every song, every minute they spent at our table is in his file. The only question is whether the people above him will read that file as evidence of a problem or evidence of a solution. Helen looked at the empty plates stacked in the sink. "And which is it?" she asked. Roy picked up the carved horse from the mantel and turned it slowly in his fingers. The firelight caught the grain of the wood. "I think it depends," he said, "on whether the people reading it have ever lost a son." In January 1945, Holt returned with his completed file. He requested a formal meeting at Camp Hearn with Roy Captain Mills and a representative from the War Department. The meeting took place in a small office crowded with filing cabinets in the faint haze of old cigarette smoke. Holt presented his evidence with the calm precision of a man who believes the facts speak for themselves. Falsified work logs, shared meals in violation of fraternization rules, equestrian activities not listed under approved agricultural labor categories, gift exchange between prisoner and civilian, each point numbered, each citation referenced. Roy listened in silence. When Holt finished, Roy said something that no one in the room expected. "Captain Holt, may I ask you something personal?" Holt hesitated. "Go ahead. You lost your boy at Kasserine. I lost mine too. Different boy, same hill, same day. Billy Dawson, 22 years old." The room went still. Holt had not known this. He looked at Roy, and for the first time he did not see a rancher who broke rules. He saw a mirror. Roy continued, "I have every reason to hate those women more than you do. One of them, and I know which one sent the signals that put the shells on Billy's position. I know her name. I see her face every morning when she rides my horse." Something shifted behind Holt's gray eyes. "You know this, and you still let her ride." "I let her ride because I know it. Because if I take it away from her, I become what their propaganda said I was. And Billy did not die for that." The silence in that office was so complete, you could hear the tick of the clock on the wall and the faint creak of the building settling in the winter cold. Two men who lost their boys on the same day in the same valley facing each other across a desk covered in files that suddenly seemed very thin compared to the weight of what had been said. Holt spoke carefully. "I respect your loss, Mr. Callahan, but respect does not change regulations. I will file my report." Roy nodded, "Then file it. But before you do, spend one day at the ranch. Not in a jeep, not with a clipboard, on a horse. Watch them work the way the land needs to be worked. Then write whatever you need to write." Holt studied him. One day he said, "That is all." He came at dawn. Roy gave him old boots and a hat. Holt mounted a horse stiffly riding the way he had been taught at the Virginia Military Institute, rigid and controlled, nothing like the loose Texas style the women had learned. They rode the north fence line together. Holt watched Ingrid lead a group checking posts, marking breaks, tightening wire with pliers. He watched Hilda examine a water tank and record the level. He watched Margaret move cattle with quiet commands to Pete that the horse obeyed without hesitation. He watched Elsa repair broken wire with gloves that were too big for her hands and a determination that was too big for her body. This was labor, real, necessary, productive labor. The women sweated through their shirts. Their hands were calloused from reins and wire. They worked without prompting, without complaint. Something was different here, and Holt could feel it even if his file had no column for it. At midday, they stopped under a stand of live oaks. Helen had sent lunch with Buck. Cold beef sandwiches, lemonade, canned peaches. The women ate separately on the ground as regulations required. But Hilda noticed Holt sitting alone against a tree apart from everyone. She walked over carrying a tin cup of lemonade. She held it out without a word. Holt looked at the cup, then at her. "Danke," she said. "Thank you." Then she turned and walked away. Holt looked at the lemonade in his hand, cool and sweet, made by a ranch wife for a work crew that included the enemies of her country. Given to him by a German nurse he had the authority to send to a swamp camp in Louisiana. For the first time in 2 years, a German had given him something instead of taking something away. At the end of the day, Holt climbed into his Jeep. Roy stood beside the door. "Well," Roy asked. Holt was quiet for a long time. Dust settled around them. A horse snorted in the corral. Then Holt said, "They work. I will note that in my report as well." He did not say he had changed his mind. He did not say he was dropping the case. He just drove away, and Roy stood watching until the road was empty, knowing only that he had done everything he could and that the rest was in the hands of a grieving father who carried a clipboard instead of a gun. The report would have to wait, because March was coming, and with it a storm that would tear through every careful calculation Vernon Holt had ever made. March 1945. The news came in waves, each one larger than the last, each one carrying away another piece of the world the women had known. Allied armies were crossing the Rhine. Cities whose names the women whispered at night, Cologne, Königsberg, Leipzig, appeared on the camp loudspeaker as captured, encircled, fallen. The map of Germany was shrinking day by day, and there was nothing anyone behind barbed wire could do but listen and wait and try not to think about what falling meant when it was your street, your church, your mother's kitchen, disappearing under the boots of advancing armies. At the ranch, the women kept working. They rode out at dawn and came back in the early afternoon, and between those hours, they moved through the landscape with a kind of desperate focus, as if checking one more fence post or tightening one more strand of wire could hold together a world that was coming apart on the other side of the ocean. Ingrid rode longer loops than necessary. Margaret brushed Pete until his coat shone like copper. Hilda cleaned and organized the medical supplies 3 times in 1 week. Elsa filled her sketchbook with drawings of the ranch from every angle, as if building a paper copy she could carry in her pocket when the time came to leave. Roy understood what they were doing because he had done it himself after Billy died. Work is the only prayer that does not require words. One morning, Margaret asked Roy a question that had been growing in the silence for weeks. Her English was strong enough now that she did not need Buck. "When the war ends, what happens to us?" Roy looked at her, this quiet woman with the secret he carried like a stone in his chest, and he told her the truth. "I do not know, but you will be stronger than when you came. That will matter wherever you go." The storm arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late March, the kind of storm Texas breeds when winter and spring collide and neither is willing to yield. The morning had been clear, the sky deep and perfect blue, and the women rode out to the north pasture in good spirits. Ingrid led a group of 4. Hilda rode alongside Corporal Jesse Wade, the young guard assigned to the north detail. Jesse was 20 years old. Sandy hair, freckled face, the kind of open American expression that made him look even younger than he was. He had arrived at Camp Hearn 2 months earlier, transferred from a training camp in Georgia at the specific request of his uncle, Captain Vernon Holt. Jesse was the son of Holt's older sister. After Daniel's death at Kasserine, Jesse was the last young man in the Holt family, and Vernon had pulled every string he could find to keep the boy stateside, where artillery and enemy fire could not reach him. Jesse thought the transfer was routine. He had no idea that his uncle had moved heaven and army bureaucracy to place him at a prisoner camp instead of on a battlefield. Holt himself had driven to Camp Hearn that morning for one of his regular visits to check on Jesse. It was not part of his official duties. He came on his own time, told no one why, and always left before Jesse noticed he was there. The uncle who could not save his own son had become the invisible guardian of his sister's boy. On this particular Thursday, Holt arrived at the camp just as the sky began to change. Jesse was assigned to guard the women's work detail, and he did his job with the earnest diligence of a young man who wanted to prove he deserved the uniform, even if he had never heard a shot fired in anger. He carried his rifle properly. He maintained correct distance. He logged the hours accurately. But he also laughed at Elsa's drawings and shared his canteen with Hilda when the afternoon got hot. He was in the way that mattered most a decent boy in a uniform that fit him a little too loosely. The sky changed at 1:30. Ingrid saw at first a line of black cloud building on the western horizon with a speed that made her stomach tighten. In Bavaria, she had known mountain storms that came fast, but Texas storms were different. They came across flat land with nothing to slow them, gathering fury as they ran, and by the time you heard the thunder, the wind was already on you. She called out to the group, "We need to head back, now." But the ranch house was 4 miles south, and the storm was faster than any horse. Within 15 minutes, the sky had gone from blue to black. The wind hit first a wall of air that bent the grass flat and sent hats spinning into the dark. Then the rain not falling, but driving sideways cold and hard as gravel. Lightning split the sky in jagged white lines, and the thunder that followed seemed to come from inside the earth itself. The horses panicked. Honey reared, but Ingrid held her years of Bavarian horsemanship, keeping her seat through the buck and twist. The other women grabbed manes and saddle horns and held on. Tommy Baker, the young guard on the south flank, pulled his horse under a stand of oaks and shouted for everyone to dismount and take cover. Jesse Wade was not so lucky. His horse was young, a 3-year-old gelding that had not yet learned to trust a rider more than its own fear. When the first crack of lightning struck a fence post 40 yards away, the horse exploded. It reared straight up, twisted in midair, and threw Jesse sideways with a violence that no amount of training could have prevented. Jesse hit a fence post chest first. The impact was a sound that Hilda heard even over the wind, a wet crack of something breaking that should not break. Jesse went down in the mud and did not get up. His mouth opened. Blood came out, not flowing, but frothing, pink foam that meant only one thing: broken ribs, punctured lung, pneumothorax, air filling the chest cavity, collapsing the lung, pressing on the heart. Without treatment, Jesse Wade had 15 minutes, maybe less. Tommy Baker reached him first, sliding through the mud on his knees, his face white with terror. He had been trained to shoot a rifle and march in formation and follow orders. He had not been trained for this. He pressed his hands on Jesse's chest and felt the unnatural give of broken bone beneath the skin, and he looked up at the black sky and the driving rain, and he froze. Hilda Kraus did not freeze. She walked through the rain the way she had once walked through the door of a field hospital at El Alamein, with a focus so complete that the rest of the world simply ceased to exist. She knelt beside Jesse in the mud. Her hands, the same hands that had once tied a rope to a crossbeam and prepared to die, moved with the precision of a woman who had decided to live and to make others live with her. She tore open Jesse's shirt. The right side of his chest was misshapen, the skin already darkening with bruise. She could hear the sucking sound of air entering where it should not. She looked at Tommy and spoke in a mixture of German and broken English that somehow communicated more clearly than any single language could. Knife. Clean. Now. Tommy fumbled his pocket knife open and handed it over. Hilda took it. She found a length of rubber tubing in the riding equipment scattered beside Jesse's fallen horse, part of a water system Buck had rigged for long rides. She cut a section free and cleaned it with the rain pouring down on all of them. Then she made a small incision between Jesse's ribs on the right side, inserted the tube, and created a drainage channel that released the trapped air pressing on his lung. Jesse screamed. The sound was swallowed by thunder, but the pain was real, a white-hot agony that arched his back off the mud. Hilda held him down with one hand on his shoulder and spoke to him in German, steady and calm, a voice that was equal parts command and lullaby. She did not know his name. She did not know whose nephew he was. She only knew that he was 20 years old and dying in the mud, and that she had the knowledge to keep him alive if her hands stayed steady. Her hands stayed steady. Ingrid held the horses. Margaret knelt beside Hilda and tore her rain slicker into strips for bandages. Elsa ran. She ran south through the storm, through rain that hit her face like stones, through mud that grabbed at her boots toward the ranch house to call for help. She ran 2 miles in conditions that would have stopped most men, and she did not stop until she reached the porch and pounded on the door with fists that were bleeding from barbed wire she had climbed through in the dark. Captain Vernon Holt had been at the camp when word came over the radio that the North detail was caught in the storm. He drove toward the ranch immediately. When his Jeep bogged down in the mud, he got out and walked, then ran following the fence line north through rain and wind until he heard voices through the roar. He came over a rise and saw them. His nephew, on the ground, blood and mud and rain, and kneeling over him, a German woman with her hands working steadily at something he could not at first understand. Holt dropped to his knees beside Jesse. His hands shook. The man who had filed reports in triplicate, who had measured work hours to the decimal point, who had built a fortress of regulations around his grief, knelt in the Texas mud with rain streaming down his face and looked at the hands of a German prisoner holding his nephew's life together, and the fortress crumbled. "Is he going to live?" Holt asked. His voice broke. Hilda looked up. She did not understand every word, but she understood the eyes. She had seen those eyes in 1,000 field hospitals on 1,000 faces. The eyes of someone who loves the person on the ground. She nodded. Ja, leapt. He lives. The ambulance arrived 20 minutes later. Medics took over. Jesse was loaded onto a stretcher, stabilized and driven to the military hospital. He would survive. The doctors would later say that without the field intervention in the first 15 minutes, the collapsed lung would have caused cardiac arrest. Hilda's hands had bought the time that Jesse's heart needed to keep beating. After the ambulance left, Holt stood motionless. His uniform was soaked, his boots heavy with mud. His clipboard was somewhere in the grass behind him, the pages ruined. He watched Hilda being led toward the ranch house by Ingrid, the nurse stumbling with exhaustion, her hands still dark with his nephew's blood. Roy stood beside him. Neither man spoke for a full minute. The storm was passing, the sky brightening in the east, and the air tasted of wet earth and ozone, and something clean that comes after violence has spent itself. "The woman who saved my nephew," Holt said at last. His voice was very quiet. "What is her name?" "Hilda Kraus," Roy said. "She is a nurse. From Hamburg. She tried to hang herself the first week she was here." Holt looked at Roy. Two men standing on muddy ground under a sky that was learning how to be blue again, and between them a truth that no file could contain. A German woman who wanted to die had saved the life of the nephew of the man who wanted to send her away. "My report," Holt said. He paused. His jaw worked. "My report will reflect the full picture." That was all. No apology, no tears, no dramatic reversal. Just a man acknowledging that reality does not fit in a filing cabinet. That sometimes the most accurate thing a report can say is that the world is more complicated than the form allows. Holt's final report to the War Department described the Callahan Ranch labor program as effective and compliant with the objectives of prisoner rehabilitation and agricultural productivity. He recommended continuation. No one outside that muddy pasture ever knew how close the report had come to saying something very different, or what changed it. 2 weeks later, on a quiet afternoon in April, Roy found Margaret alone in the horse barn brushing peat. She hummed a folk song from Stuttgart. Something soft and sad in her hands moved along the old horse's mane with a tenderness that made Roy's chest ache. He sat down on a hay bale. He was silent for a long time. Then he spoke, and because Margaret's English had grown strong enough over the past year, he did not need Buck. "Margaret, I know about Kasserine." Her hand stopped mid-stroke. The brush hung in the air. Her eyes widened, then closed. She did not ask what he knew or how long he had known it. She understood. "Billy Dawson," Roy said. 22. He was my boy, not by blood, but by everything else. Margaret turned to face him. Tears ran down her cheeks, cutting lines through the ever-present dust of a Texas barn. She did not offer an apology because there was no apology large enough. She said only this: "I did not know his name. I did not know any of their names. I only knew the numbers on the frequency." Roy nodded. "I know. That is how war works. Numbers, not names." The barn was quiet except for Pete shifting his weight and the soft sound of birds outside. Roy looked at Margaret, and she looked back at him, and between them was a distance that could not be closed by words, but could perhaps be made bearable by honesty. "I want you to know something," Roy said. "I decided to let you stay, not because I forgave you. I have not. Maybe I never will. But I decided because Billy would have wanted me to be better than this war, and because you are more than the worst thing you ever did." Margaret nodded. She did not believe she deserved those words, but she received them because there was nothing else to hold on to, and because the man who said them had earned the right to say them in a way that no one else on earth could claim. He had stood at the gate with a leather strap in his hands and chosen to hang it back on the wall. That choice gave his words a weight that mercy spoken cheaply could never carry. From that moment, something shifted between them. It was not forgiveness. Roy was clear about that. It was recognition. Both of them were caught in the machinery of a war that turned people into instruments, and instruments into killers, and the only choice left was whether to let that machinery define them or to insist against all evidence that human beings are more than the functions they perform. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. The word capitulation came over the camp loudspeaker on a Tuesday, and the world changed its shape. For the guards, it meant the beginning of the end of their duty. For the women, it meant something more terrifying than any battle. It meant going home to a country that had been bombed into rubble and occupied by the armies that bombed it. Orders came through the chain of command with the slow certainty of a season changing. The prisoner of war program would wind down. Between late 1945 and 1946, the United States would repatriate nearly all of the 425,000 German prisoners it held. At Camp Hearn, that meant closing the labor details, including Roy Callahan's ranch. Letters arrived first. Margot's came from Stuttgart. Her family house was gone, burned in a bombing raid. Her mother had survived, living with cousins in the countryside. Her father was dead, killed in the final chaos of the collapse. She handed the letter to Helen with shaking fingers. Helen sat with her on the back steps of the ranch house and let her cry into her shoulder. Roy watched from the kitchen window. He saw his wife holding the woman whose signals had helped kill Billy, and he said nothing. There are moments when silence is the bravest thing a man can offer. Ingrid's letter brought word that the stable where she had taught children to ride in Bavaria had been seized by the army. The horses were slaughtered for meat during the last terrible winter. For 3 days, she barely spoke. She went through the motions of work like a sleepwalker. Then on the 4th morning, she went to Honey's stall, brushed the mare until her coat shone, breathed in the familiar warmth of horse and hay, and slowly began to talk again. Some beauty lives, she wrote later. Even when the world cuts down most of it. Hilda received no letter at all. Her family was in Hamburg, the city destroyed by Operation Gomorrah in July 1943, when Allied bombers killed more than 42,000 civilians in a single firestorm. She did not know who had survived. The not knowing was its own kind of wound, deeper in some ways than bad news, because bad news at least has a floor. Helen insisted on a farewell supper. No tree this time, no carols planned, just a simple meal. Stew made from beef raised on the ranch, bread baked that morning, coffee brewed strong and black. The house filled with the warmth of cooking, the same warmth that had greeted the women on Christmas Eve, but now carrying the weight of an ending. The women arrived in their worn uniforms. They brought what they could: small drawings, letters written in careful English, another carved figure or two. The ranch hands brought gifts as well. Sturdy boots worn but solid, work gloves softened by years of use, a few warm coats for the long journey back to a continent that had forgotten what warm meant. Ingrid pressed a folded paper into Helen's hand. Inside was an address in Bavaria. "If you ever come to Germany," she said, "please find me. I want you to see it when it is green again." Helen nodded, knowing she would probably never cross the ocean, but also knowing that promises feed the spirit the way food feeds the body, and that sometimes a promise kept in the heart is worth more than a journey completed. Even Renate, who had not spoken to Ingrid in months, approached her before the meal and said something very quietly in German. Buck, standing nearby, pretended not to hear, but later he told Roy what she said. "She said you were right. I was afraid to say it then. I am still afraid. But you were right. On their last day, Roy did something the regulations never imagined. He let the women ride one final wide loop through the north pastures. Just a light guard behind them, far enough back to be almost invisible. The morning was bright and sharp, the sky a deep blue bowl turned upside down over the flat earth. Grass brushed their boots. Wind carried the clean warmth of sun on soil and the low sound of cattle in the distance. They rode mostly in silence. Each woman felt the rhythm of the horse beneath her, the weight of the saddle, the leather reins warm in her hands. At a high point overlooking the valley, Ingrid stopped Honey and looked south. Below them lay the Callahan Ranch, the low house, the corral, the windmill turning slowly against the sky. Beyond that, miles away, the barbed wire of Camp Hearn glinting in the sun. She could have ridden south, past the ranch, past the camp, past the towns and the farms and the filling stations, all the way to the Rio Grande and across into Mexico. No one was close enough to stop her. The thought crossed her mind the way a bird crosses a window briefly and without landing. She did not move. She closed her eyes and breathed in the warmth of grass and leather and the horse beneath her, and she understood something she had not understood before. Freedom is not the absence of fences. It is the presence of something worth staying for. "I tried to memorize it," Elsa wrote later. The color of the sky, the sound of the hooves on dry earth, the way the wind moved through the grass like a hand smoothing a blanket. "I thought if I can remember this, I can survive whatever comes next." When they returned, they slid from the saddles slowly. Hands touched the horses' necks one last time. Brushes rasped over coats. Hooves were checked for small stones that were not there. They were stretching out the goodbye, the way you stretch out the last hour of a day you know will never come again. Helen took a few photographs with a borrowed camera. 12 women standing beside horses, the wind lifting their hair, the Texas sky enormous behind them. None of them knew those photographs would sit in a family album for decades, growing soft at the edges, the faces slowly fading, but never quite disappearing. That evening, the truck came. The women climbed in. Chains clinked softly against the tailgate. As the truck pulled away, they looked back at the low house, the corral, the windmill turning against the sky that was turning from blue to gold to red. Roy and Helen stood at the gate with Buck beside them, watching until the dust clouds settled and the road was empty, and the only sound was the windmill and the horses shifting in the corral and the quiet that lives inside the space where people used to be. If this story has moved you, if it has shown you something about the war you did not expect, take a moment now to share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Hit subscribe if you have not already. And stay with me because the story of these 12 women does not end on a dusty Texas road. It stretches across decades, across oceans, across generations. And the final chapter is still being written. Most of the women reached Germany in late 1945 and early 1946. What they found was worse than they had feared. Streets of broken stone, roofs burned open to the sky, families scattered across a continent that had forgotten what home meant. Ingrid Brandt found part of her family in Bavaria. The farm was damaged but standing. The stable was a ruin, but she rebuilt. Slowly, board by board, she reopened a small riding school. Children sat in saddles again under her watchful eye, learning the same balance and patience she had relearned on a Texas ranch 4,000 miles away. Letters crossed the Atlantic for years, thin envelopes with foreign stamps. Today, a little boy trotted for the first time, she wrote to Helen. I thought of Texas. Margaret Vogt returned to a Stuttgart she barely recognized. Her father was dead. Her mother was thin and quiet and old before her time. Margaret trained as a teacher and spent her career working with the orphans who had lost everything. In a 1953 letter, she wrote, I teach them English. Sometimes I use phrases I learned on the ranch. When I say plenty more where that came from, they do not understand, but I remember the full plates and I smile. She never told anyone about Kasserine Pass. She carried that knowledge the way Roy had carried it, silently and with a weight that never fully lifted. But every year on the 22nd of February, the anniversary of the battle, she lit a candle in her bedroom and sat quietly for 1 hour alone with the names she never knew and the signals she could never take back. Hilda Kraus found her mother alive in Hamburg. The old woman had survived the firestorm of Operation Gomorrah in a basement shelter, breathing through a wet cloth, while the world above turned to flame. Hilda worked in German hospitals then, with the Red Cross, then in clinics that served refugees. She never stopped being a nurse. The hands that had once tied a rope to a crossbeam, and the same hands that had saved Jesse Wade's life in a thunderstorm, spent the next 40 years stitching wounds, setting bones, and sitting beside beds where people were afraid to die alone. In 1960, she received a letter from America. The handwriting was young and careful. But Krause, it read, I am the boy whose chest you opened in a thunderstorm in Texas. I am alive because of your hands. I am a high school teacher now in Virginia. I coach the track team. Last week, one of my students asked me about my scar, and I told him a German nurse saved my life during the war. He did not believe me. My uncle, Captain Holt, asked me to write this letter. He died last month. Before he died, he said, tell the German nurse I was wrong. Hilda read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the same drawer where she kept the photograph Helen had sent her 12 women and 12 horses under a Texas sky. She sat at her kitchen table in Hamburg and wept not from sadness, but from the particular relief of learning that a circle you thought would never close has quietly completed itself while you were not watching. Elsa Richter became an artist. Her paintings showed German women on horseback under a blazing Texas sun, guard towers soft in the background, cowboys extending open hands instead of rifles. In the 1960s, her work hung in galleries in Munich and Stuttgart, quiet and powerful, asking viewers to reconsider the simple stories they had been told about enemies and friends. One painting, her most famous, showed a woman on a horse at the top of a hill looking down at a ranch spread across a valley, the sky enormous and blue, and the title of the painting was a single word, Bleeben, to stay. Roy Callahan kept ranching until his death in 1968. His son James came home from Italy and took over the daily operations, but Roy never fully stepped back. He rode his fences into his 70s slower, but no less attentive, checking posts and wire and water tanks, the way the women had shown him, with an eye for detail that came from caring about the land and the people who worked it. Among his papers, Helen found letters from all 12 women thick with thanks and news, and the small details of lives rebuilt from rubble. The carved horse sat on the mantel where Ingrid had placed it on Christmas Eve 1944, its wood worn smooth by decades of dusting hands. The letter Roy wrote to Hank Dawson, the letter that could never be mailed, was found folded in the kitchen table drawer next to the telegram that announced Billy's death. Helen read it one more time before she put it back. She did not show it to the children. Some things belong only to the people who live them. Helen died in 1985. Her children found the letters and the old photographs, 12 women standing beside horses with the wind in their hair. They did not know every name, but they knew the story. They had grown up hearing pieces of it, the way children hear pieces of their parents' lives in fragments that only form a complete picture long after the tellers are gone. Captain Vernon Holt died in 1960 in Virginia. His estate included a single personal item that puzzled his family, a rusted tin cup that he kept on his desk beside his service medals. No one knew where it came from or why he kept it. It was the cup Hilda had used to bring him lemonade under a live oak tree on a Texas afternoon, the first time a German had given him something instead of taking something away. He never explained it. Some debts are too private for words. The years passed. The 20th century became the 21st. The ranch changed hands, was subdivided, was partly sold to developers. Camp Hearn closed in 1945, and the building slowly fell apart, eaten by weather and time and the particular indifference that Texas shows to anything that does not keep producing. But local historians and veterans groups established the Camp Hearn Museum on the original site, preserving what remained of the barracks and guard towers and the stories of the men and women who had lived behind the wire. And then in 2019, something happened that no one could have planned. Sarah Callahan Roy's granddaughter, a retired schoolteacher living in San Antonio, was overseeing renovations on the old family ranch house north of Hearn. Workers tearing out a bedroom wall found a thin envelope tucked between 2 layers of pine planking, hidden so carefully that 75 years of dust had sealed it like a tomb. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in neat German handwriting, dated December 1944. Sarah could not read German. She brought the letter to a history professor at the University of Texas, who unfolded it with the careful hands of a man accustomed to touching things that time has made fragile. He read it aloud, translating as he went. To the American who gave me back the act of writing. I do not have words large enough in any language to say what your ranch has meant to us. You looked at women your country called enemies, and you saw human beings. You gave us horses when the world gave us chains. You said we were too thin to work, and then you gave us work that made us strong. I cannot repay this. I can only promise that if I survive what comes next, I will teach others what you taught me. That mercy is not weakness. That kindness is not surrender. That a horse does not care what flag you serve. It only cares whether you are brave enough to trust it. If someday someone in your family reads this letter, please know that in a small town in Bavaria, there is a stable where children learn to ride because of what happened on your ranch. Come and find us. I will teach your grandchildren to sit a saddle the way you taught me. The letter was signed Ingrid Brandt, and below the signature was an address in Bavaria. Sarah searched the internet that evening. The address still existed. It was now a small riding school on the outskirts of a village in the Bavarian countryside. The school was run by a woman named Katrine Brandt, Ingrid's granddaughter. Sarah flew to Munich. She rented a car and drove through green countryside that carried the scent of cut grass and pine past villages with church steeples and flower boxes and the quiet order of a land that had rebuilt itself from ashes. The riding school was exactly as you might imagine it. A wooden stable, a fenced corral, horses standing in the morning light, coats shining brown and black and cream. On the wall of the stable office hung a framed black and white photograph. A young woman on horseback squinting into the sun with flat Texas land stretching to the horizon behind her. Katrine Brandt opened the door. She was in her 40s, strong and tan, with her grandmother's clear eyes and steady hands. Sarah stood on the doorstep holding a photocopy of the letter and a photograph of Roy Callahan standing beside a sorrel mare in 1944, and for a moment neither woman could speak. Then Katrine smiled. It was a smile that crossed 75 years and 4,000 miles in 2 languages in a war that had tried to make their grandparents hate each other, and it landed in that doorway as softly and surely as a horse stepping onto familiar ground. My grandmother said you would come, Katrine said in English, with an accent that carried the hills of Bavaria in every syllable. She said it might take a long time, but she said an American always keeps a promise. Sarah wept. Katrine wept. Then Katrine led her to the stable, saddled a chestnut mare, whose coat was the same warm copper as Honey's had been, and said the words that close a circle begun on a dusty Texas morning in 1944. Come, I will teach you to ride, the way your grandfather taught my grandmother. The carved horse that Ingrid gave Roy on Christmas Eve 1944 now sits in a glass case at the Camp Hearn Museum in Hearn, Texas. The wood is dark with age, worn smooth by the hands of 3 generations of Callahans who dusted the mantle where it stood for 70 years. Beside it is a small brass plaque donated by the Callahan and Brandt families together, and the plaque reads 7 words that say more than any history book. Carved by a prisoner, given to a captor. Proof that mercy outlasts war. The story of 12 German women on Texas horses is a small thread in a war that killed 60 million people. It will not appear in most textbooks. It did not change the outcome of any battle or the terms of any treaty. But it shows a truth that is easy to forget when the numbers get large and the flags get loud. That even in the worst of times, ordinary people can choose to see human beings where the world sees only enemies. That a plate of food shared across a table can do what 1,000 bombs cannot. That the decision to say you are too thin to work, spoken quietly by a man with every reason to hate, can echo across generations and oceans and decades until it reaches a doorstep in Bavaria, where a woman smiles and says, "My grandmother said you would come." This was not propaganda. It was reality. And reality, when it is this good, does not need to be invented. It only needs to be remembered. If you want to hear more true World War II stories told this way, human and detailed and full of surprises, that challenge what you thought you knew, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the like button. Share this video with someone who believes that mercy is weakness, and let this story change their mind, the way a Texas rancher changed the lives of 12 women who came expecting whips and received horses instead. And in the comments, tell me which moment in this story hit you the hardest. I read every single one. Thank you for staying with me to the very end.